Hi, everybody. We are back, and we're going to be talking about motivation in this section. This chapter covers motivation and emotion, so we will get to emotion later on. But we're going to start just with some basic principles of motivation, and then we'll move into specific motivations like hunger and work and things like that. So let's get started. Okay, first let's define what motivation actually means. A motivation would be a need or a desire that energizes our behavior and directs it toward a goal. A good example of motivation would be Aaron Ralston. I don't know if you guys remember, but probably 10 years ago now, he was out hiking in a slot canyon in Arizona, and a rock came down on his arm and pinned him into the slot canyon. And he was alone, no one came by. He was stuck there for days with that rock pinning him to the wall, and he had no way of getting the rock off of him. And ultimately, as you can see in the picture, he ended up amputating his own arm so that he could free himself and go get help. He's a really interesting case because what was motivating him? What would make it possible for a person to be able to remove their pocket knife from their pocket and cut through their own flesh? I'm going to assume that his bone was probably broken by the rock, but if it hadn't been, cutting through bone, that takes a lot of motivation to be able to do those behaviors. So what motivated him? I mean, I guess he was probably pretty hungry after a few days being trapped under that boulder. But what about more ambiguous motivations, like the motivation to survive? The idea that we want to continue, maybe tomorrow will be better, those kinds of drives that we have. Evolutionary psychologists would point out that maybe, underlying all of that is his desire to reproduce, to get his genes into the future. Even when you ask him what motivated you, he oftentimes is at a loss for words to explain what allowed him to do something that most of us couldn't bring ourselves to do. But in that circumstance, he felt like he had no other choice. He was motivated by the lack of other options in order to do the thing that would be super hard to do. But underlying that motivation is probably that overwhelming motivation to survive. And hunger, for example, is a good example of something that keeps us alive. And so that's why we're motivated to eat and to seek out food and things. So a lot of times at the heart of a lot of our motivations, you can distill it down sort of evolutionarily to the idea that we want to get our genes into the future. We want to survive because we want to reproduce. That's the evolutionary psychology interpretation of it. As we discussed before in chapter 2, this is one way of interpreting things. So don't assume that that's all there is. We have some other things to say. So let's talk about some of the different perspectives on motivation. Okay, so let's talk about hunger just as an example. So when you get hungry, one of the things that happens when you haven't eaten in a while is that your blood sugar goes down. And then that triggers a bunch of symptoms of hunger, like your stomach starts growling, you start to get lightheaded maybe, or your hands start to shake or things like that. Those states, the growling stomach, the lightheadedness, those states push you toward finding something to eat, right? So motivation can be viewed as something that pushes us towards certain behaviors. Now, what if you just ate lunch? Your stomach's full, your blood sugar is where it needs to be, there's no growling stomach, in fact, your tummy's all full trying to process that food, and everything's fine, but, somebody has cupcakes that look like ice cream cones, or maybe you went to somebody's birthday party, and there's going to be cake, or all your friends are having ice cream. Even though you're full, you kind of want to participate with your friends. These are examples of what we call pulls. You're not being driven towards eating. You're being pulled by the stimuli around you to go ahead and eat, even though you really don't need to. So some of our motivations are pushing us towards behaviors, And some of our motivators are external, and they're pulling us towards behaviors. So we'll talk about that. Let's talk for a second about sort of an evolutionary concept, the idea that maybe instincts drive our behavior. So an instinct is defined as a fixed pattern of behavior. It's not acquired through learning. It's something that you're born with and you have to do. Like, you need some place to live. We have an instinctive need to have, protection from the elements. So for humans, that may take the form of, buying a house, renting an apartment, something like that, or, building a place to live. It's not that different in concept from what animals do, but you'll notice that here we have an example of a bird who has to build their nest like that, right? Like, this is their instinctive way of building their housing. Humans don't have that, right? Humans have the need to have a roof over our heads and have shelter from the environment, but it can take lots of different forms. I mean, just Google housing around the world and you'll see all the different ways that humans have solved the problem of giving themselves a roof over their head. And look across time how humans have, and proto-humans have solved the problem. Sometimes they've used caves, sometimes they've used, branches of trees and work them together. And there's like lots of different ways that humans solve the problem. We aren't fixed. There are lots of different ways that the concept of bird solves the problem, right? Lots of different birds do lots of different things. Out my window here, there's a tall pole with a flat board on the top that egrets, not egrets, what are they called? The other word for them is seahawk, and I'm having trouble coming up with the osprey. Osprey use these flat pieces of wood to nest on. And so a human built that for them, put a big pole up there and put a flat piece of wood, and then the osprey come and build their stick nests on top of it every spring. The fact that they can use something that we provided implies that there's something out in the environment that they normally look for that would have that kind of structure, and then they can build on. But they need that. Like, if there isn't an appropriate flat thing that's up high for an osprey to build their nest, they're not going to build their nest. They're not going to say, well, I guess I could build it in a different kind of tree, or maybe I could build it on top of this rock outcropping or something else. They have this instinctive need to build a nest the way that they were designed to build their nest. Humans don't quite have that same level of fixed behavior. We do display instincts, right? We do have the same parenting instincts, or babies have the same instinct to suck and swallow and all the other things that we talked about before in our chapter on development. These are general patterns of behavior that we can explain through natural selection. And this is where evolutionary psychology comes in, this idea that some of our behaviors are displayed today because they have been beneficial to our species across time. That from antiquity, these were behaviors that helped our species to survive and adapt and reproduce and things like that. So certain general patterns of behavior could probably be explained through natural selection. The kinds of things that evolutionary psychologists tend to talk about are things like mate selection. They talk about facial expressions and language. They talk about aggression, things like that. One of the things we have to acknowledge, though, is that humans are a lot more flexible in expressing their instinctive drives than other animals are. Like, our species is the most flexible in expressing its instincts. And so while we have an instinct to have a roof over our head, it can take lots of different forms. We have an instinct to eat. Well, what we consume can take lots of different forms. How we acquire it can take lots of different forms. So there's a lot more flexibility, but underneath it, there are probably basic instincts or motivations that are driving those behaviors. Okay, so now that we have kind of the concept of motivation down, and this push versus pull issue, that it might be something from inside you pushing you towards a behavior, or something out in the world pulling you towards the behavior, let's talk about those pushes, those times that you have something going on inside of you that you are motivated to change. We call that drive reduction theory. When you have low blood sugar and your stomach's growling and you're getting a little lightheaded and your hands are starting to shake and things like that, it puts you in what we call an aroused state. So in psychology, we use the word aroused to mean that you're alert or edgy or something like that. It's not solely referring to sexual arousal. We're talking about that could be the drive, but we're talking about other kinds of arousal, right? Alertness, things like that. So if you have an aroused state or a tense state, and it's related to a physical need, that's going to cause a drive towards reducing the drive by doing a behavior that will address that physical need. So your stomach's growling, your head's light, your hands are shaking. All of this is due to the fact that your blood sugar is low. That's going to drive you to find something to eat so that you can reduce that drive. So you can, I have some food in me. I'm not feeling all of those things anymore. I'm less aroused or tense. My physical need has gone down, and so now I'm no longer driven towards seeking out that food. We're motivated to reduce drive. When we're in that state of edginess, when we're in that state of discomfort, we're motivated to do whatever behavior will help us to reduce that drive. Our goal really is to achieve homeostasis. We want to be, our bodies would like it if we were always in a nice, constant state, right? Like the right amount of food in our stomachs that we're not hungry anymore, but we're not so stuffed that we feel like a little bit of pain in our stomachs. You've probably all experienced that. So we want to be the right amount of fed. We want to have the right balance of fluids in our bodies. So we want to drink enough, but not too much. We want to sleep enough, but not too much. Not too little, not too much, right? Because if you sleep too much, you might have had this experience where if you sleep too much, you actually wake up kind of feeling worse. You might even have a headache or things. Because, I mean, think about it. If you sleep too long, you're not eating, you're not drinking, and that's causing other kinds of symptoms in your body. So you want to sleep the right amount so that you're rested. That's the idea. You want to be rested. You want to be alert. If you start losing alertness, you want to take a nap, right? Your body is wanting you to do the things that would put you back into homeostasis so that you're experiencing a steady internal state of just basic balance. So you will develop a need if something is out of balance. If you haven't eaten recently or if you haven't drunk anything recently, that's going to cause a need that's going to then fuel a drive. It'll manifest itself as hunger or it'll manifest itself as thirst. That's going to drive you towards drive-reducing behaviors, right? So it's going to push you to find something to eat or find something to drink so that you'll feel better, get back to that internal balance. But not all of our drives are purely biological that could be, rectified through eating or sleeping or drinking or having sex or something like that. There are times when all of your biological needs have been met and all that homeostasis is present, but you still feel tense or aroused or bored or some level of psychological out of balance. Us and other primates, elephants, the members of the cetacean family like porpoises and whales and stuff, all of those species show a propensity to want psychological stimulation as well as the physical homeostasis. Horses do it, dogs do it. The idea is that we want to bring ourselves to a level of psychological arousal that's neither too high nor too low, right? We don't want to be bored. We don't want to be overstimulated. We want to be at the right level of arousal. These monkeys are engaging in some curiosity behaviors. They're like, what are these things that are stuck to the wall? How do they work? They're trying to figure it out. That kind of curiosity helps them to avoid boredom. They've found in research animals that if they're given little puzzles and things like that, their psychological health is preserved more than if they are just sitting in a boring, nothing-to-do cage. They are understimulated in that circumstance. When they have puzzles and things to do, it helps to offset the boredom. And so novelty seeking seems to be one of those psychological things that helps us to feel in balance. Humans in particular really are not just trying to solve physical puzzles and things like other animals might do. You might know horses who, for example, chew on their stall cross pieces until the stall wood almost breaks. They've been doing it over and over and over, that kind of repetitious behavior. That doesn't usually satisfy humans. Humans want to know stuff. We're infovores. We really like to know things. And so being exposed to new things, whether it's through experiences like in this picture, or if it's reading about it, or watching a documentary or a movie, or things like that, humans really are brought into balance when they feel like there's a good match between how the world is and their understanding of the world. It makes humans feel more relaxed. And so that actually aligns really well, again, with developmental psychology when I was talking about Piaget and his idea that we assimilate and accommodate information into our existing schemas. He says basically our goal with assimilation and accommodation is to maintain what he calls equilibrium. The word I introduced here is homeostasis. This idea that there's a match between what we know and how the world really is. Humans like to feel like they understand the world around them. And so we have something kind of different from other species, that drive to understand. Now, what about performance and our arousal level? The Yerkes-Dodson law, which is a really old law from the very early days of psychology, argues that if you're under too much arousal, it can interfere with your performance. If you've ever been in any kind of performance-based presentation, whether it was you acted in a play, or you played a sport, or you danced or sang or played an instrument, or any of those kinds of things, you know that if you're too nervous for the level of competence that you have with the piece that you're going to perform, it can really interfere with your performance. They in sports call it choking. Right, you're going to shoot some free throws in basketball, and everybody's watching, and you normally can shoot and score every single time, but now everybody's watching, and the game is on the line, and too much arousal, and so the person chokes. And we can do it in a play performance, right? You knew your lines until the audience got in there, and suddenly you can't remember what the next line is, right? These are examples of times when the Yerkes-Dodson law seem to support human behavior. Here's the thing that you have to keep in mind, though. The Yerkes-Dodson law seems to really apply to difficult tasks. If you are trying to do something difficult, like remember your monologue in a play, or shoot free throws with an entire, gym full of people watching you, things that have a possibility that you're going to forget, or that you're going to, twitch one little muscle and it's not going to work right. That kind of difficult task seems to interfere, arousal tends to interfere with that more than an easy task. If you've got an easy task, and particularly an easy task that you've really overlearned, you've done it and done it and done it and done it until don't even have to consciously think about it anymore. I talked about this when I talked about memory, the idea that you've got overlearned tasks, things that you've done and done and done and done until you can do it without any conscious awareness. Those kinds of things don't seem to be impacted by the Yerkes-Dodson law. Your level of arousal actually being, stimulated by the audience might actually cause you to perform better on an overlearned task. An overlearned task that now you're doing sort of lifelessly, you're delivering your lines for this play, and you're not doing it with any feeling or anything. You've practiced it to death. Now there's an audience in front of you, and suddenly you've got all the emotion and all the extra meaning that you wanted to impose. So easy tasks actually benefit from arousal. Difficult tasks, actually, you do better with low levels of arousal. So you can kind of take control of those things. You can practice and practice and practice and practice until it's overlearned, so that on opening night, you deliver your lines correctly. You can practice and practice and practice your free throws, doing it in front of people and all sorts of things, so that in a game, you don't choke. Of course, it's not perfect, right? Every game is different. For something like taking an exam, it turns out that moderate levels of arousal are probably beneficial to people because you know some of the material really, really well. And like in a psychology class, some of the material you probably knew before you even took the class. And so those things you're actually going to do well because you're in a heightened state of arousal. You're going to do better with a little bit of arousal. Harder items, maybe material that you're not as familiar with, or maybe the question was phrased in a really complex way, you're going to do a little bit better if you can relax. So one of the things I like to tell students so that they can take advantage of that is go through an exam one time quickly, answering all the items that you very easily know. Like go through anything that jumps out at you and you can answer it, answer those. Okay, I'm feeling pretty good. I actually got like 20 out of the 50 already answered, and I just answered the ones that I knew really easily. Hey, I do know this stuff. Let's go back and look at the other ones again. And again, I would go through and move on if you don't immediately have an answer for the question. When you take a multiple choice test, read the prompt, the opening lines of the question, and then try and think of the answer. Don't look through the alternatives because you'll confuse yourself. So just look at the prompt, think to yourself, do I know the answer? And if on the second pass, if you think it's this or that, you're not sure it could be this or that, say to yourself, okay, I'm not answering it yet. Go back through the test like that, answering the ones that you do feel comfortable with, but maybe you have to put a little more thought into. Final pass, go through again and answer the ones that you had left. And now maybe you've learned something during the other questions that will help you to answer the ones that you weren't completely sure on. But hopefully by that third pass, you've gotten rid of some of those antsy, anxious, nervousness feelings, and now you can actually concentrate better. If you're taking an online class, one of the downsides of this advice is that by the time you're going through for the third time, you might be seeing the timer ticking down, and that spikes arousal. So that's kind of hard to get around, isn't it? Maximize your screen so that the timer is not visible so that you don't remember how much, it's because it sits there and ticks right in front of you. It is kind of taunting. But that's my best advice for how to lower your arousal level as you're taking the test. All right, I'm going to finish this with just this Maslow model, and then we'll take a break after this model. So the hierarchy of needs or motives was introduced by Abraham Maslow. He was a humanistic psychologist. You might remember that from chapter 1. His perspective was that humans are always striving for satisfaction of their basic needs first and foremost. And then once those basic needs are met, then they start moving up the hierarchy of needs towards the more and more complex motives. So here's a nice depiction of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. At the very bottom, you've got the physiological needs: hunger, thirst, the need for sex, things like that. So those physiological needs, the things that will kind of keep you alive and keep your physiology in balance and like that. For most Americans, we have the physiological needs probably about 90% satisfied. So for most Americans, they can turn their attention to safety needs. Now, not all Americans, right? Some Americans are hungry. Some Americans are living outside and don't have their physiological needs met. They're cold, or they're too hot, or they're hungry, or other things. And so what you'll notice is that people who are in those circumstances oftentimes don't seem to be concerned about their safety at a level that a well-fed, housed American would be. The idea of sleeping on the street and knowing that somebody could do something to you while you're asleep, or take your things, or things like that, that pops into the mind of a person who's well-fed and has a home and things like that. When you're living on the street, you're like, where's my next meal? And you're not as concerned about the possibility that somebody might harm you. So having concern about your own safety is sort of a step up, right? Above that basic, will I stay alive, physiological motivations. Now I'm concerned about, could something happen to me? Could somebody harm me? Could I fall off of that thing? Those kinds of issues become concerns at a level that's higher once we've got our physiological needs met. So we've got, under physiological, we've got breathing, sleep, water, food. sex, things like that. Safety needs, the security of your own body, your health security. If you're concerned about being exposed to something and that it might have long-term health concerns, that's going to take up some of your motivational capacity. So those kinds of concerns can take away from you being able to climb up the hierarchy. According to Maslow, about 70% of the time our safety needs are met for most Americans. And so they then have attention that they can place on the next higher level, which is the love and belongingness level. These are going to be our concerns with, forming friendships and, having a secure family and, not the physiological need for sex, but that sexual intimacy that comes from a relationship or an ongoing, connection to somebody else. He says that for most of us, we're looking at about 50% of our love and belongingness needs being met. So we have some energy left over to deal with the esteem needs. Self-esteem, of course, is feeling good about yourself, feeling good about the people who you come in contact with, feeling like other people respect you. Those kinds of things would all be bound up in the esteem needs. So for Maslow, the bulk of our energy as a typical American is bound up in the esteem and the love and belongingness needs. Esteem is met about 40% for most Americans, he says. And so what we do is we tend to spend our time cycling through the esteem and the love and belongingness levels, trying to make sure that people love us and that we have people to love and that we feel good about ourselves and other people feel good about us and that we have people who we respect. And that takes up most of our energy. Periodically, you're hungry, and you dive down to the physiological need being the most pressing need, right? My tummy's full again. Now I can start wondering, oh my gosh, it's dark now and I have to walk out to my car. Suddenly I'm feeling a little anxious about that, right? So you can kind of start climbing back up through the hierarchy again once things are met. The last level on his hierarchy is self-actualization needs. And he says that this is where our highest sort of humanity kinds of motives are housed. So our morality, our spontaneity, creativity and problem solving he placed up here also. And by problem solving, he didn't mean like being able to solve your math problems for homework. He meant like coming up with good solutions to everyday problems or problems at work, things like that. Being able to look at other people with equality and, accepting the world for what it is. Those are all what he thought were examples of self-actualization. He said that we spend only about 1% of our day engaging in self-actualizing behaviors, that most of our day is spent in the esteem and the love and belongingness. So that's his model. He could be completely wrong. One of the problems with Maslow's hierarchy is that it's really hard to scientifically measure, to really establish where a person is in the hierarchy or which behavior illustrates which level. I oftentimes have students who will list going to college as an example of a self-actualizing behavior, but it kind of isn't because, you may get to engage in some creative behaviors or some problem solving and things like that, but really most of us go to college because we want to get better jobs and we want to be able to, provide physiological and safety needs for ourselves and for maybe our future families. And we know that maybe we will be more marketable if we have college degrees. And, then also we think to ourselves we might make friends while we're in college or find our future mate or something while we're in college. We feel better about ourselves when we do well in a class. We can respect our faculty maybe and respect our peers. Things like that. And so a lot of the things that we do in college are really bound up in the lower levels, not the self-actualization levels. If you are taking classes and really wanting to know the material, regardless of what grade you get, if you really are, focusing on improving yourself as a person rather than attempting to get a degree for monetary reasons or status reasons, something like that, you are probably displaying some self-actualizing tendencies. And it's kind of what we always hope as professors is that you'll want to know the material because it's interesting and might be helpful for you. And we're hoping that you're less motivated by just, wanting to get a degree so you can get a better job. But the reality is almost every behavior is a mix. it's some part self-actualizing and some part self-esteem and some part belonging, right? It's like hardly any behavior that you can think of is purely self-actualizing. So we probably all do a little bit of self-actualization each day, but probably the bulk of most of our days is spent in the lower levels and satisfying those motivations. All right, let's go ahead and take a break here, and we'll talk about hunger in our next section.